Have you ever noticed that the more you try to hold on to a relationship, the more you're taken for granted? The more you reach out, the quieter they become. The more sincere you are, the more indifferent they grow. And then, not through a fight, but through a prolonged silence, you suddenly become an outsider in the very place where you were once deeply valued. You don't leave right away. You wait. You keep giving, keep texting, keep being patient. But all you receive in return are half-hearted replies, unexplained silences, and a growing sense of smallness within you. It's no longer disappointment in them, it's disillusionment with yourself for trying too long in a game the other person was never really playing. And then you stop. Not with noise, not with anger. You just stop. And something strange happens. When you stop chasing, they start unraveling. Not because of love, but because they've lost control. They were used to your presence, your availability, your role as the one who always kept the connection alive. Now, the silence you create becomes a mirror reflecting their own emptiness, a power you never realized you had. In today's video, we won't talk about winning with words or retaliating with silence. This is a quiet journey of retreat, not to escape, but to reclaim sovereignty. Stoicism doesn't teach you how to manipulate others. It teaches you how to free yourself from manipulation by rebuilding your boundaries through calm and intention. Today, we'll walk through the deepest layers of letting go to understand this. When you stop chasing, they don't just stop walking, they begin losing the very power they built on your endurance. 1. Don't beg for attention, withdraw your presence. There is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from work or the body, but from constantly needing to prove you deserve someone's attention. You speak more than necessary, respond faster than reasonable, trying to keep alive a connection that the other person never once moved toward. You don't call it begging. You reassure yourself it's effort, sincerity, not wanting to lose something important. But deep down, you know, if something requires this much effort just to survive, perhaps it never truly existed. No one is worth sacrificing your inner peace just to receive a glance. And no connection is truly deep if your presence must always be negotiated. We've grown too used to the feeling of needing to hold on to others, as if they are the strings tethering our worth. But that's an illusion. Other people's attention does not define you. They can turn away. They can fall silent. They can coldly withdraw from your life as if you never existed. But you are still here, whole, complete, and worthy without anyone's validation. What you need isn't to say more or to prove how much you've cared. What you need is to withdraw your presence, not because you no longer feel, but because you refuse to place your presence where it's no longer met with respect. Withdrawal is not running away. It is a conscious, courageous act. When you stop showing up so easily, others are forced to face the void you once silently filled. When you're no longer the one initiating, asking, listening, healing, the silence you leave behind isn't just empty space. It's a mirror. And that mirror reflects the true nature of the relationship. A prolonged imbalance, indifference disguised as intimacy, devotion without reciprocity. As long as you're there, people forget how much they've received. But when you quietly disappear, they're forced to remember not because you reminded them, but because they begin to feel the emptiness once filled by you. A calm retreat holds more power than any criticism. No anger, no warnings, no demand for fairness. You don't need to end things with a dramatic scene. Your withdrawal is a silent yet resolute period. You don't need to reply to messages that show no care. You don't need to continue conversations that survive only on politeness. You don't need to keep dancing a waltz when the other person stopped long ago. Stoicism doesn't teach us to abandon people, but to abandon what causes us to abandon ourselves. Epictetus once said, "Remove whatever does not serve your soul." And your presence, your time, energy, attention, compassion is sacred. It is not to be consumed, exploited, or exchanged for shallow attention. It must be protected, cherished, and reserved for what is worthy. So the next time you feel the urge to do something more to keep someone, pause and ask yourself, is my presence being wasted? If the answer is yes, withdraw, not in anger, not in despair, but in understanding. You no longer beg anyone to look your way. You have returned, looked within, and realized you never lost your worth. You were just placing it in the wrong hands. And now it's time to take it back. 2. Stillness is magnetic. When you stop, they start running. People often think silence is surrender. That if you stop speaking, stop responding, stop moving forward, it means you've given up. But not all silence is defeat. Some silences are the strongest declarations you'll ever make. Because only when you truly stop do those around you begin to feel your presence through the void you leave behind. As long as you keep talking, they can ignore you. As long as you stay, they can overlook what you bring. When you're always the initiator, your presence becomes default. No one feels the need to keep something that's always available. But when you go quiet, without warning, without anger, without needing to prove anything, just quietly stop, that slowness wakes them up. Not because they suddenly realize you matter, but because your stillness disrupts the rhythm they once depended on. Every silence becomes an unanswered question, and the human mind cannot tolerate unanswered questions. There's a paradox no one teaches us. People start chasing you only when you no longer move toward them. They once looked at you and saw nothing special, but now they sense your absence in the smallest things. A message that never comes, a question left unasked, a quiet withdrawal of presence. And when they return, it's often not because they love you more, but because they feel the loss of power they once had when you were the one still holding on. Stillness is not manipulation, not a weapon. It's simply a low-pressure zone where those who once disregarded you start gasping for breath in the steadiness you now hold. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "When you internalize your value, you are no longer shaken by outside reactions." Others may come to ask why you've changed, but you don't need to answer. Your silence is the answer. Not because you no longer care, but because you now care about something more important, balance within yourself. And then they panic. They scroll through old messages, dissect your last words, try to hear your voice again in memory, searching for one last signal. But you're no longer there, not because you're lost, but because you've stopped dimming your light just to preserve a lopsided bond. You're not trying to make anyone regret. You're simply living at the highest stillness of your inner world, where no one can control you with half-hearted coldness or ambiguous actions. They start running, but it's no longer you standing still behind. It's you moving toward yourself, and they can no longer keep up. 3. Never trade loyalty for uncertainty. There is a quiet kind of wound few know how to name, being forgotten inside your own loyalty. You stay. You don't walk away. You don't let go. You ask for little. You believe that if you remain steady, patient, and giving, they'll eventually see and appreciate it. But what you don't realize is when loyalty is placed in the wrong hands, it doesn't become strength, it becomes self-inflicted harm. You're not loved because you're loyal. You're simply used as a stable foothold. They don't need to be clear because you never stop to ask for clarity. They don't need to choose because you've silently chosen for them. And so you remain stuck in a connection with no name, no bond, no definition, all because you respected their feelings so much. You forgot to ask yourself, and who's safeguarding mine? There's a kind of ambiguity that isn't born from confusion, but from their awareness that you'll stay, even when they give you nothing to hold on to. They keep you with half gestures, unfinished promises, distances close enough to spark hope but far enough to never commit. That's not cluelessness. That's unconscious strategy built on the belief that you won't leave. Seneca once wrote, "Be careful what keeps you silent, for prolonged silence teaches others how to hurt you without speaking." Loyalty, when not placed in the hands of someone who honors it, is mistaken for passivity. And passivity, when misdefined, becomes a mirror reflecting disrespect. They are not cruel. They're simply living the way you've allowed. Don't call it affection. Don't call it sacrifice. Call it what it is. You are trading your dignity to sustain a non-committal ambiguity. And you hope that if you're good enough, persistent enough, something will change. But you forget one thing. No one changes when things are too easy. No one values what's always there without needing to be kept. You can love sincerely, but don't love in the dark. You can be loyal, but don't let loyalty become the chain that binds you to someone who never truly meant to hold you. Because at some point, the ambiguity is no longer their fault. It becomes your choice. 4. When you stop explaining, you start being heard. There are times when you say everything, every emotion, every wound, every disappointment. You carefully choose your words, trying not to hurt anyone, never crossing the line, just hoping they understand. But what you get in return is silence, a thoughtless nod, or worse, a reply that has nothing to do with the pain you just tried to voice. And you think, maybe I need to be clearer, maybe I wasn't patient enough, maybe next time they'll get it. But what you don't realize is this. You're stuck in a loop of unnecessary explanation, a habit that feels like connection but is actually draining you. When you're always the one explaining, it means you're the only one trying to keep the connection alive. The other person doesn't listen to understand, they listen to react. They don't receive your feelings, they're analyzing whether they're being blamed, losing leverage, or how they can spin the situation. And each time you repeat yourself, your voice no longer sounds like someone longing to be understood. It becomes the hollow echo of someone begging to exist in another's mind. That's when you need to stop. Not because you're wrong, but because you're speaking to someone who isn't ready to listen. And when you stop, not out of anger, not from hurt, but because you know you deserve to be truly heard, everything starts to shift. In that silence, they must finally confront the emptiness you once filled with your patience. They hear what was never heard before, not because you raised your voice, but because you went quiet. Epictetus once taught, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we may listen more than we speak." But you've lived for too long in reverse, speaking more than listening, because you've been doing the work for both. And that's not compassion, it's a quiet, unbalanced sacrifice. A relationship where one must always explain and the other only needs to exist is no longer a relationship, it's a form of dependency. You don't need to keep explaining just to be understood. What you need is space quiet enough to see who actually wants to understand you, even when you say nothing. And if that person never shows up, or stays unchanged despite all you've shared, let your silence be the final truth they must face. No one learns anything when you fill every gap with words. The right silence is the sharpest sound. It doesn't accuse, doesn't shout, doesn't demand change. It is simply the retreat of a soul too tired of constantly proving it has worth. And when you stop explaining, you're no longer the one seeking understanding, you become the one being watched. Your presence is no longer taken for granted. Your silence is no longer empty. It becomes a reminder. I'm still here, just not the way I used to be. 5. The powerless one is the one who can no longer read you. There is a silent kind of power in every relationship. The power of the one who reads your mood before you even understand it yourself. They know when you'll reply. They know you'll forgive, even when you're angry. They know you'll come back, even after you've walked away. And that ability to predict that weeding is the weapon that keeps you beneath them in the balance of connection. When they're used to you always explaining, always reacting, always softening exactly when they expect. Your every gesture becomes predictable, no longer freedom, but a map they've memorized. But then one day, you go quiet, not like before. You don't respond at the time they expect. You don't justify. You don't explain. You don't blame. You just stop. No signals to read, no reactions to analyze. This isn't a tactic. It's the natural result of someone exhausted from being manipulated through their own kindness. And in that moment, the balance starts to shift. Not because you're playing Cold War, but because you've reclaimed the space you once unconsciously gave away. When others can no longer read you, they can no longer control the connection. They begin to doubt. They start questioning. They scramble in the silence that was once filled by your reactions. They search for old patterns, familiar reflexes, but all of it is gone. Because you are no longer the predictable version of yourself. Your silence isn't a refusal to communicate, it's a redefinition of how you exist in that relationship. You don't need to scream to be understood. You just need to stop doing what they once saw as guaranteed. Marcus Aurelius once said, "He who masters his mind cannot be harmed." But to master your mind, you first must reclaim control over how you react. You cannot keep letting others read your every emotion, anticipate your every reflex, steer your every action, and still wonder why you feel led. Freedom begins when you become unpredictable, not to manipulate, but to restore your inner privacy. When no one knows what you'll do next, you begin to regain the power of choice. When they're no longer sure you'll respond, forgive, or keep investing emotionally, they begin to realize the void you left isn't easy to fill. And that's when power shifts quietly but decisively. People only fear losing what they can no longer grasp. A predictable soul is a replaceable soul. A familiar reflex is an undervalued one, but someone still enough not to react, deep enough not to explain, and clear enough not to need to be understood. That person changes the rhythm of the entire room. When you become the void they can't fill with control, you're no longer the one chasing. You become the one they chase just to understand how they lost what they thought they always had. 6. Don't try to fill the void. Let them face it. There's a deeply human habit. We fear the void. We fear silence after a sentence goes unanswered. We fear an unconfirmed glance. We fear the growing coldness that no one dares to name. And in that fear, we rush to fill. With apologies when we did no wrong. With explanations when none are required. With kindness offered on autopilot, unable to distinguish between love and submission. But filling the void doesn't make it disappear. It only makes us the sole one rushing in a relationship where sincerity is no longer mutual. Some relationships don't break because of one big mistake, but because of small silences no one dares to confront. Every time they go quiet, you reconnect the string. Every time they pull back, you step forward with all your patience. But maybe you never asked yourself, What happens if you stop? What if this time you don't rush in? What if this time you let the void be what it is, a test of balance? When you stop filling the gap with one-sided effort, you return space for truth to appear. With no reaction from you, they are forced to face their own withdrawal. You are no longer their excuse to avoid their inner world, no longer their shield from emotions they refuse to confront. And that's when the imbalance reveals itself, no accusation needed, no judgment given, just silence doing the work of awakening. Seneca once wrote, "We suffer not from what happens, but from how we perceive it." When you stop seeing the void as something to hide, you begin to see it as the space that shows who's truly walking beside you. If someone feels nothing in your absence, trust that your presence was never valued. If your silence makes them uneasy, makes them remember, makes them question, that's a sign you once mattered, even if they lacked the courage to admit it. The void is not a wound. It is a mirror. And you don't need to break it just because they're not ready to look. Let it remain whole, reflecting the truth you were once too busy to see. They will be confused. They will make excuses. They will blame you for being distant, but that's not the truth. The truth is, you stopped being the fixer, letting them hear the echoes of silence you once covered with love. And then you'll realize, the void protected you from a love that was no longer healthy. It shows you who stays for you, and who stays only for the comfort you provide. When you stop holding both sides of the bridge, the other person must either take a step or let it collapse. And if it collapses, don't grieve. What you lost wasn't an authentic connection, it was an illusion you once held alone. Your stillness isn't retreat, it's silent growth. You're not closing the door. You're just no longer the one keeping it open at all times. 7. Only when you stop needing them do they realize they once needed you. People only start counting footsteps when the sound on the floor disappears. Only start looking around when the familiar figure no longer passes by. And only start thinking of you when you no longer think of them. It's paradoxical, but deeply human. As long as you still need them, they feel secure. They know they're important. They know you won't leave, won't turn away, won't refuse. But that very certainty makes them stop seeing the value you bring. Your presence becomes expected, your kindness becomes obligation, and your patience becomes something they believe comes free. Until one day, you change. Not with anger, not with accusations, just quiet, clean withdrawal of your energy. No more check-in messages, no more gentle reminders, no more stepping forward to mend the distance. And suddenly, they realize the thing they thought would always be there is now gone. Not because of some dramatic event, but because of an awakening. Not because you've turned cold, but because you've stopped needing them to feel valuable. The moment you stop needing is the moment the power dynamic shifts. They start doing what you used to do, measuring, wondering, waiting. They begin thinking of you not as someone who needs them, but as a part of life they carelessly lost. The previous indifference becomes regret, and the previous certainty now turns into uncertainty, because they no longer know what you're thinking, no longer know if there's still a place for them in your inner world. Epictetus once said, "He who doesn't value what he has simply never feared losing it." You once feared the loss. That's why you tried to hold on. But when you stopped, you gave them the first taste of that fear. The fear of losing something precious without a second chance. You're no longer chasing validation. Now they're chasing something they never appreciated before: your trust, your loyalty, and your unconditional care. This change doesn't need noise, doesn't need an announcement, doesn't need a speech that says, "I've changed." They'll feel it in the way you're no longer present like before, in the way you remain calm, still kind, but no longer trying, no longer carefully holding on to something that no longer belongs to both of you. And in that moment, they begin to look back at what you've done, the things they once overlooked, once deemed ordinary. But you're no longer there to hear the apology, no longer there to wait for a change. You've stepped out of the cycle of hope and disappointment, not because they don't deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve freedom. Freedom from needing to be seen through the eyes of someone who can no longer see deeply. When you stop needing them, you begin needing yourself. And nothing is more powerful than someone who once placed others too high, now learning to place themselves exactly where they belong. Not in a place of arrogance, but in a place of awareness. 8. Don't seek justice where fairness never existed. Some relationships make you feel like you're searching for justice in a system that was never fair to begin with. You wait for an apology they never even think is necessary. You hope to be understood, while they only care about maintaining a silence that serves them. You keep speaking to a wall where your sincerity becomes a tool for them to maintain power, never a starting point for understanding. And then you wonder, was I unclear? Or were they never willing to listen at all? When you stay in an unfair situation long enough, you start dreaming of justice as some rightful ending. You want someone to realize. You want them to feel guilty. You want their silence to be replaced by awakening. But the inner world doesn't work like criminal law. No court processes coldness. No sentence exists for someone too immature to love you properly. And what hurts you isn't just how they treated you, it's that you expected fairness in a place where it never existed. The more you wait, the more you hurt. The more you hope, the more you slip into helplessness. Because you're seeking answers in a place where truth is always distorted. You're searching for clarity from someone who's mastered the art of making you doubt yourself. You keep believing that if you're patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough, things will eventually return to the fairness they should have had. But that's just an illusion. A beautiful fantasy of justice built from the shattered pieces of pain, not from reality. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be. Be one." The problem is not that you lived wrongly. It's that you lived rightly while waiting for validation from someone who never learned how to acknowledge what's right. They don't see your sacrifice as valuable. They see it as expected. They don't believe they need to change because you never dared to leave. And that makes them believe they are right. You cannot find justice where fairness never existed because in that space, the rules you respected have been replaced with a game rigged to benefit the other. The more effort you give, the weaker you appear. The more you wait, the more you're dismissed, and then one day you awaken, not out of hatred but from a painful realization. Not everyone deserves the justice you worked so hard to build from your heart. From that moment, you stop arguing. Stop offering proof. Stop trying to be understood because you're no longer inside a courtroom with no judge, no truth, and no justice. You walk away not because you lost, but because you're no longer willing to imprison yourself in a space where you constantly must defend your own existence. You don't need justice from the unjust. You only need to be honest with yourself, and that is the deepest form of justice. 9. Calmness leaves them nowhere to hide. They're used to people reacting, used to one cold comment triggering a flood of explanations, used to their silence making others anxious enough to fill the gap with pleading. In a world where everyone rushes to speak, calmness becomes what they fear most, because when you don't react, they have nothing to hold on to, no guilt to reject, no anger to fight, no blame to play the victim. All that's left is themselves and a silence with no escape. When you're calm, You don't just withdraw your presence. You force them to face a mirror, to confront the void they once had you fill. They once ignored your words because you said too much, took your actions for granted because you were always the first to act. But when you stop, no blame, no anger, no labeling, that stillness becomes a mirror they cannot distort. There are no responses left to give, no blame left to shift onto you. They are forced to see themselves without you as the excuse. It is in that calm that old power structures collapse. They no longer read you, no longer predict your next move. They once controlled the game through your emotional instability, but now you are no longer pulled in. You need no apology, no explanation, and that unsettles them more than rage ever could. Because when you need nothing from them, they lose their most powerful weapon, the ability to control you through your own reactions. Seneca once said, "No one can make you angry without your consent." But here, you've done more than refuse anger. You've refused to play the emotional chess game they're used to with everyone. In their eyes, you become a mystery, not because you're pretending to be, but because you have nothing left to prove, nothing left to reclaim. And that quiet clarity makes it impossible for them to use their old tricks. Calmness is not detachment, it's power. A form of strength that doesn't need to control anyone, doesn't need to defeat anyone. It only requires you to be fully anchored within yourself. When you're no longer driven by impulse, you begin to lead the situation not through words, but by not reacting, not responding to what's meaningless, not touching what's undeserving. And in that silence, you leave no opening for them to keep playing the same game. They once believed you needed them more than they needed you. But now, they're the ones lost in front of a version of you that's no longer predictable, no longer shaken, no longer drawn into chaos. You don't avoid, you don't fight, you simply stand still. And it's in that stillness that they find there's nowhere left to hide. 10. When you stop chasing, you don't just withdraw emotion, you reclaim power. We often think that when we stop loving, stop caring, stop expecting, we're withdrawing emotion. That we're becoming tougher, colder, more distant. But in truth, what you're withdrawing isn't just emotion, it's power. The kind of power silently given away through every message you initiated, every time you forgave, every moment you waited for someone who never quickened their pace toward you. As long as you're still chasing, you place them in the position of control. They have the right to step forward, pull back, stay silent, or speak up, and you're only allowed to react. They set the scene, and you must adjust your emotions to fit it. But the moment you stop, when there's nothing left to justify, nothing left to hold on to, that power structure collapses. Without a sound, without a declaration, but with clarity and finality. You don't need to seize power, you only need to stop offering it. People don't lose power because you oppose them. They lose power when they no longer influence your emotional state. When they're no longer sure if you're sad or angry or coming back. When your silence no longer signals hurt, but becomes a form of purification, clean, untangled, unbound. They're not afraid of losing you because you threaten to leave. They start fearing because you no longer need them the way you once did. And in that absence of need lies a distance they can't bridge with any apology or belated gesture. Marcus Aurelius once said, "When you awaken from illusion, all you lose is what was never truly yours." The power you thought they held, it came from you abandoning control over yourself, from allowing someone else to define your emotional worth, from trading your inner peace for a temporary connection. And when you awaken, you don't need to announce your departure. You simply stop moving toward them. And in that moment, you begin returning to yourself, to a place where emotion is no longer manipulated and power is no longer unconsciously surrendered. You don't become stronger by controlling others. You become stronger when you reclaim the right to control your own responses. When you no longer need anyone to understand, no longer need to be chosen, no longer need to win in an invisible tug of war. When you stop chasing, you begin to walk not because someone leads the way, but because you are finally clear enough to see. No one is worth losing yourself just to remain. I used to believe that if I were patient enough, kind enough, and clear enough, a relationship would eventually find balance. That if I didn't give up, they would eventually see something worth keeping. But in the end, the only thing I was holding on to was an illusion. The illusion that my presence was irreplaceable, while in reality, I was merely a convenient option when they needed me, and an easy silence to ignore when they didn't want to face themselves. I wasn't naturally strong. I once forgave too much, explained too often, hoped for too long. But what awakened me wasn't an argument nor a clear rejection. It was the moment I realized I had nothing left to say, nothing left to hold on to, no emotion worth continuing to give. And in that emptiness, I found release. I didn't feel hardened, I just felt awake. If something in this video left you silent, let it stay with you. Authentic feelings don't need to be rushed into words. But if you're ready, feel free to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming content. Because sometimes, all it takes is the right moment and you'll reclaim every ounce of power you once gave away. And begin again. Not with noise, but with a quiet, no one can ignore. See you in the next video.